Hello and welcome to this new episode of Benchmarks in Transition. In this episode we will continue to analyze LIBOR fallback. In particular, in this episode we will look at the adjusted risk-free rate part of the fallback. As usual, enjoy!
IBOR fallback, adjusted risk-free rate or floating rate. The proposition by ISDA for the replacement or the fallback of LIBOR is to use an adjusted risk-free rate based on any of the underlying risk-free rate and to do it through composition. It means that we will use, like on the screen, the usual way we do composition for rates. So the multiplication of 1 plus delta the rate, and we will do that on the period where we should have add LIBOR. So this is good because it's an interest rate which is computed on the same term, on the same period, and this is very similar to the mechanism which is used for OIS. On the other side, there are a couple of questions. For this type of composition, for OIS, usually the payment takes place like here 2 days after the period. In this case, it is not an OIS, but we replace an existing LIBOR, so we cannot select the payment. It has to be where it was, so on the payment associated to the LIBOR. So we go back there. Also, if we look at this date here, there are 2 dates, one which is the date associated with the end of the LIBOR tenor, tau, one with the end of the accrual period, V. Are they the same? Often yes, but often also no. In particular, when there is a non-good business day, we will see that tau can be after the end accrual V. So that's not clear what will happen there, but I want to emphasize the payment date, which in the best case will be here, but in some case it is even here. For example, for a FRA, where the payment is done in advance, or a LIBOR in arrears, where the fixing in arrears, but it can be viewed as a payment in advance. So what do we have? We have this floating rate, which is done by composition. In LIBOR, it was F theta measurable, so on the fixing date we knew the result. Now, if we use this mechanism, it will be FSN measurable. It's only at the end of the period, here at the end of this accrual period, that we know the numbers. You may tell me that this is only a technical question to know if this is measurable on the payment date or not, but it is, yes, a technical issue, but it's mainly a practical issue. We are in a situation where we have to pay a given amount, but we don't know which amounts we have to pay. The amount is known only later, maybe 3 months later. So that's one of the big issues with this approach. And if you want more details, there are, for example, something that was written 18 months ago, and there is a version from 2 years ago where this is described. This has been acknowledged by ISDA and other people. In particular, I've put on the screen a couple of cases where this is described. In a webinar by ISDA, it was indicated that it's unclear if this fallback will be workable. In a ISDA IQ, so ISDA quarterly, it was indicated that for more exotic trade, such as forward rate agreement, the standard fallback may be less appropriate. Note that in this context, forward rate agreements are considered as exotic trades. And in the consultations, there were also answer that were saying that this fallback will work only for plain vanilla interest rate swaps. And more recently, there was a paper by Peter Bach which described also some of those issues. In practice, it means that to deal with this fallback, if this fallback goes forward, you will need a fallback of the fallback. For the cases where this generic fallback does not work, you will have to discuss bilaterally with your counterparties and make a fallback of the fallback. So that's the general description of this fallback through composition in arrears. Another solution would have been to look at term rate or OIS benchmark. To describe that, I'm going back a couple of slides to this slide, and I look at the timeline. So in LIBOR case, we are on the fixing date and we are looking forward, what is happening in the next 3 months, for example. We could do the same and still look at overnight. We could say, I will not compute in arrears the overnight on that period, but on that date, on this fixing date, I'm asking what is my best estimation of what would be the composition? What is a fair rate for this composition? And that's a question that is easy to ask because there is a market for it, and it's called OIS. The OIS is exactly answering that question. What is a fair rate to a fixed rate over that period that is equivalent to the composition of overnight? So if I go back to this slide, this would be a possibility to create a benchmark based on OIS. Why it is good? Because it's a term rate, so no problem with those questions of when you have the information. It's on the correct period. It is similar to OIS, and it has the same fixing behavior and risk profile than LIBOR. What is not good is that first it was not in ISDA consultation, so you could not even say that you liked it. And two, today there is not an actual benchmark, a compliant benchmark, compliant term rate, which is doing exactly that. But on the other side, this term rate is recommended by ARC, so the US Alternative Rate Committee, for bonds, loan securitization. So even if not yet in the term sheet for derivatives, it is recommended for a lot of other products. In a consultation on the Euro side for Euribor fallback, the majority of the respondents believe that it is essential or desirable to have such a term rate for the fallback. Today, we have already those type of benchmark based on derivatives. They are the ICE swap rates. They are based on the LIBOR derivatives, but still it's based on derivatives. So it's not impossible to create those IOSCO EU BMR compliant benchmark based on derivatives. In particular, ICE is planning to have a new version of the ICE swap rate based on SONIA, that's for the sterling side. In sterling and euro, in each case, there are 4 benchmark providers that have offered to compute those term rates and to create all the infrastructure for it. And in the US dollar side, the term rate is expected by the end of 2021, and it is part of the task of ARC to create such a benchmark. And also, you can find indicative forward-looking SOFR term rate published by the Fed. So this is something that would be possible, but for the moment, on the derivative side, it's not going forward. A good question regarding those forward-looking rates and backward-looking composition in arrear is, are they similar? If I want, obviously we know from an operational point of view, they will be very different in the accrual period. But before we enter in that period, if I look at it from today, what's the difference between those forward or term rates or those in arrears, composite in arrears rate. For that, I've done a small computation, a little bit of quant work. Let's look at what would be the forward-looking case. So we are today, we have a payment at some date, V, on a rate which is like LIBOR, fixed on some theta for a period between U and V. So the fixing here is in theta and the payment is in V. Now, if I look at this quantity, this forward rate, I can obviously introduce into my expectation a conditional expectation, conditional to the information I will have around theta. Why I'm doing that? So I'm introducing a second expectation. It may look more complex, but why I do that is that in theta, the value of something that paid a forward rate, by definition or by construction, that will be just the OIS, the price of the OIS, so the forward rate discounted. Now, after a little bit of simplification, we have the expectation of the discount factors, but the discount factors are the price of assets, so they are martingale. So the price of this discount factor in the future is equal to the price today. So this thing, the valuation of a payment related to the forward rate is very easy, is the difference of two discount factors. Now, that's on the forward rate, on the term rate. If I look at the backward looking is this long product, but this is exactly the floating payment of an OIS. And we know very well what's the price of the floating payment of an OIS is just the difference of discount factor between the start and the end. So difference of discount factor here, difference of discount factor there, so they are the same. For any purposes, in terms of valuation, risk management, up to the fixing date, up to that date, theta, those two mechanisms are exactly the same. So that would not be a problem to switch between one and the other, or to have one for part of the transaction and the other for others. So in particular, for things like FRAS and LIBOR in arrears, we could use those forward-looking rates. So this is on this equivalence or equality in terms of risk management between those two. And the last thing I wanted to discuss in this section about the rate, the floating rate, is a little bit the description of the details of the dates. So on the top of the screen, I've put a normal OIS. We have the accrual and compounding period, which are the same for an OIS, and the payment take place a little bit later, let's say 2 days later. What is happening in the case of the fallback? So we have this accrual period, which is equal to the compounding period, same thing, but what is the payment date? The payment date is equal to the end of the accrual. So here it's a difference. We have moved this here. That's the W that we have there. So we'll have to take care of that. We will do that in 1 minute. The second thing I wanted to point in this screen is the end of the LIBOR period that I have called tau at the start in the discussion. Is where is that in this graph? In the best case, it is equal on the payment date, equal to the end of accrual, but very often, as also discussed in the introduction, this date will be later. When there are non-good business days, it will be there, and it is not exceptional. It may be something like two coupons out of 7, 2 because there are 2 weekends, and 7 because there are 7 days over the week. So it's not exceptional to have the tau there. But let's ignore that and look just at this part. To go back to the situation similar to there where there is a lag in the payment, the proposal in the ISDA more than a proposal, no, it's a decision because it was in one of the consultation, is to move this period like this. The compounding will not be done on the actual accrual period, but on a different period. This period is a backward shift by 2 business dates. So this date will be moved in that direction, by 2 days, and the same for the start. So it's looking very nice. You have to be very careful. Those are business days. So even if it is 2 business days, in terms of calendar days, if there is a weekend, that will be 4 days. If there is a holiday, it may be 5 or even 6. So the number of calendar days that you move here at the end, at the end and here at the start may be different. It means also that the actual period will not be done on the same period, the same number of days than the compounding period. So you will have to be very careful on the accrual days, on the accrual factor multiplication, but hopefully all your system will do that correctly. Plus, there is something which is not too much discussed also, is calendars. If I take dollar, there is a lot of calendars that enter into the game. There is the LIBOR calendar, which is London, so London, UK, which decide of the fixing. The payments, the end and start of the payment accrual period are on a New York calendar. In some cases, the swaps have also the London calendar for the payment. But the replacement, SOFR, is on a different calendar. SOFR is on a government security calendar. There are not too many differences between New York and government securities, but 1 or 2 or maybe 3 days a year. So it's not very clear in this case, those dates, if there will be New York dates, good business days, government securities, if we introduce London or not. So we have a general description, but the exact meaning of moving there is not yet fully decided. And with that concludes this episode on the description of the floating rate. And in the next episode, we will discuss the spread between this floating new overnight-based floating rate and LIBOR, or at least some kind of replacement of LIBOR.